is Heidi Binko. I'm the co-founder of the Just Transition Fund, as Robin said. And for those of you that don't know, the Just Transition Fund, we work in communities all across the country where both coal plants and coal mines have closed. And I actually launched the fund in 2015 with the express purpose of trying to help these communities access federal funds under the Obama Power program, which was the first time that federal funding was ever made available to help coal communities in transition. So it was a big deal. And so in these communities where we're actually across the country, we're working in the hardest hit places, the places that have the least capacity, because we thought it was important to go there first, right? And we are solving, and I think this is really important for the conversation that we're going to have today, we're solving very specifically an economic problem, right? We are trying to help grow local economies and diversify what had been, in many cases, mono economies, right? And it's through that work when the people and the families in those places can have a vibrant economic future in a post-coal economy. That's how you build political will for climate solutions. But they're not going to get there if they don't see that, if they can't feed their families, if they can't access this funding, right? So Robin, this kind of brings us back to this incredible opportunity, which I agree is going to look very different in the next number of years than it's looked at now. I'd even go one step farther with your bills and add ARPA to the list, because with ARPA, bipartisan infrastructure, CHIPS and science, Inflation Reduction Act, coal communities alone have hundreds of billions of dollars available to them for economic development and revitalization, and a host of other purposes too, right? But coal communities have never had that amount of money. Solely through the IRA at the DOE, there's one program, the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Act, that provides, that provides $250 billion in loan guarantee financing for community economic revitalization in places where power plants have closed. We've never seen this opportunity before. But in the places that I work, there is a deep mistrust of government. So unless we can help these communities access this federal fund, and that's a big part of what we do through our Federal Access Center, which I'll talk about in a little bit, funding is not going to simply flow to the communities that need it the most, right? We need to see targeted intervention, and it's only by accessing these funds, putting them to work in these local communities to really grow the local economy, create the right kinds of jobs for the people that have been hardest hit, that we're going to see this next generation of climate power being built.
Thanks, Heidi. Rich, last but not least, I wanted to go to you because I think one of the things that has been really heartening to me about the last few years is that 3 out of the 4 bills that I mentioned were bipartisan. And I think that really speaks to there being a really great opportunity to bring Republicans along and to get them bought in on, what needs to be done on climate. I wanted to get your take on, having worked with Republicans in that process, what in the bills that have passed are they most excited about and most supportive of? And what's your take on what we need to do to keep them on our side as we move into this implementation phase?
Well, thank you for the question, Robin. It's wonderful to be here with you. Thank you, Aspen, for having this wonderful conversation. I'm very excited to be up here. And it's great to see so many great friends here in the room. It is very heartening that we've seen this extremely constructive tack from a number of Senate and House Republicans, all the way up to Speaker McCarthy, who has a proactive energy conservation and climate agenda that they're now starting to work through in the hearing process that's underway right now in D.C. I think literally right now. Did anybody see John Curtis last night on stage? Anybody? Wasn't John Curtis great, right? So John is flying back up. Representative Curtis is flying back up to D.C. Where they're starting to take up legislative consideration of a number of permitting reform bills. I'm sure that these bills are not perfect, but they do deal across the board with how we reform and modernize the permitting and the siting processes for energy projects of all kinds, inclusive of clean energy projects. So I think what conservatives have been most excited about this tack, these last couple of bills that have been passed, are first that these are big tent clean energy bills, and so they take on all of the forms of clean energy. So going all the way back to the Energy Act of 2020, that bill had programs and incentives inclusive of renewables. So for example, they had huge investments in long duration energy storage, which as most folks know is one of the long poles in the tent for deeper penetration of variable renewable energy in many parts of the country. They also took on how to go the next step with cleaner fossil fuels, so huge investments in both carbon capture for fossil power generation and carbon capture for industrial process line. Most folks know that's half of our clean energy today. Many of those plants were in danger of going of retiring early due to economic conditions in the states. That's the if you're the first rule of getting out of a hole is to stop digging the hole deeper, right? So we cannot let any clean generation in this country prematurely retire, especially base load clean energy generation, which is kind of uniquely valuable. So I think conservatives were very excited that it was a big tent clean energy solution. They were also very excited that it was an innovation-focused clean energy solution. I mean, if we think about the success story that has been the U.S. decarbonization story since 2015, in absolute terms, we've had the greatest decarbonization of any developing country on the planet. How did we do that? We did that primarily through our power sector, where emissions are down about 40% from their peak in 2005. How did we do that? A mix of two things. A switch from coal to gas in many of our power plants, and an increasing build of renewable energy alongside that. The nice thing about the switch from coal to gas is that it was a relatively inexpensive switch. So we made significant federal investments back in the 80s and 90s that unlocked the fracking revolution. We made significant investments through a tax incentive in the 90s and early 2000s. And then the market took up and made that switch largely happen because gas was just better than what it was replacing. It was lower emitting, it was better performing, and it happened to be a heck of a lot cleaner than the coal that it was displacing. And so that accounted for about 2/3 of the reduction. And so conservatives look at that story and they say, well, why can't we have more shale gas type revolutions? Why can't we have technologies that are better performing and cheaper and that happen to be clean, so that we could see markets help us take those up alongside government policy, help us take those up in the United States, and crucially around the world where the real tons are. Now that the United States is down to about 10% of global emissions, we really need to be providing the rest of the world with technologies that markets can help take up, because there will be government policy in other places around the world, but particularly developing economies are unlikely to pass very stringent carbon policies, at least in the near term. They're just going to be focused on electrifying and developing their energy economies as quickly as they possibly can to meet all of their other sustainable development goals and human development needs. And so we need to provide them with better performing, very low cost technologies that are clean if they're going to scale them up. And so I think conservatives will really found this innovation focused approach very appealing, because it's something that you can actually imagine scaling up globally. It's kind of treating the U.S. energy system as a test bed for globally relevant clean energy technologies that we could then actually see dispersed around the world. So I think that that's been very appealing as well.
Great. Well, we'll come back to siting and permitting in a minute. Very much a topic of discussion right now. But I did want to, on the flip side, have a little bit of conversation here about what the kind of under the radar opportunities and issues might be, because I was thinking about, the spirit of Aspen Ideas is really to surface those, those things that you can't get anywhere else. And I thought it would be good to get everyone's take on, is there anything that you think is an under-discussed, underappreciated opportunity or challenge going forward with implementation? And Heidi, if you don't mind, I think I'll put you on the spot on this first, but anyone can react, because we had a really interesting conversation about broadband that I thought you might want to speak to.
Don't you guys love it how the lady always gets put on the spot first? No, it's fine. I'm just teasing you. No, actually broadband, right? That's the thing that I would bring up. So, JTF, I'd mentioned to you, the way that we think about the problem is identifying the places that have been hardest hit. And when you're talking about transitioning coal communities, the coal communities that are hardest hit in this country happen to be in rural areas, right? And that makes sense, right, if you think about it, because often, when these plants or mines close, they're the only game in town, so they're going to have an outsized impact on the local economy, right? And so we have been working on looking at rural issues and for a number of years and working in these places, and of course trying to do economic development. And when we do economic development, it's in a range of sectors, of which clean energy is one. But there's a number of different sectors that we invest in, and we kept hitting up against the fact that we could not help put into place the economic development programs or the workforce programs that we wanted to get in place and built up, because those communities faced a tremendous lack of broadband access. And we don't necessarily think about this, but we took an informal survey, and a third of the coal communities that we work with in this country have way below what the rest of us would consider adequate access to high speed broadband, right? And so if you don't have broadband, again, many of us don't think about this, right? We don't think how disconnected the country is, and this is a problem not only in rural areas but in urban areas. But it really hits hard with rural areas because of the economic development, right? You can't do economic development. People they can't be entrepreneurs. They don't have access to online markets, right? You can't participate in online workforce development programs, right? And you certainly can't do climate change and implement climate energy 2.0 technologies when you don't have access to the internet that's going to allow you to, sort of use demand response and other technologies. So I think that's something we really need to think about. It's one of those under the radar issues, that's really not being invested enough in. And I'll just leave you with one point. We took a look at what philanthropy was doing to invest this, and less than 1% of philanthropic giving by large foundations goes to support these issues. So you tell me how we're going to get where we need to be if we don't fix that problem first.
So much, so much to say. Or really, I wanted to pick up actually on two things. One, Heidi spoke a little bit about the challenge around the transition of communities in coal plants or in fossil fuel kind of areas, and I just want to underscore that is an issue I think the environmental movement has been late in fully recognizing. I remember it was fall of 2020, and the leading paper in Pittsburgh, which was looking at who to endorse for the presidential election. 50 years had always actually endorsed a Democratic candidate. And in 2020, they endorsed the Republican candidate. In no small part, in the editorial of this Pittsburgh paper, was because that the party and the environmental movement talked a lot about clean energy jobs, but could not link how national or state level jobs speak to the realities of the communities in which they're working in now. Right. And so that ability to get granular, to get specific, it isn't a headline number. It's actual individuals, specific communities, thinking about what a just transition, what a new growth opportunities look like for those communities, just incredibly important. So just to underscore Heidi's point about how important that is. In terms of what is not spoken about, I'm just going to say two very quick things. One is we have felt that there was a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act that tied offshore oil and gas leasing to offshore wind that we found to be actually quite problematic. Now, I know different people will have different views perhaps on the need for oil and gas at the moment, but from where I sit in terms of what I believe the United States needs to do, to borrow the phrase of if you're in a hole, stop digging, we are in a hole and we got to stop digging. So that linking of those leases I found to be a little bit problematic and something that we need to shine a light on. The other piece, and this picks up a little bit on what Rich said, which I entirely agree with, is that the United States is incredibly important to the global conversation on tackling climate, but necessary, but far from sufficient. So what do these bills do to honor the commitment we need to make, both on mitigation and on finance for the rest of the world? And I don't think it speaks a lot to those issues. And I think that is a major glaring gap in where we need to be as a country in terms of providing the support needed to help other countries with the energy transition. So just a couple of thoughts on that.
Well, so first let me say I very much agree with Manish about the big remaining need on, you call it U.S. foreign policy, U.S. exports policy, U.S. Foreign aid policy, U.S. technology and trade policy to get all of this out into the world, right? We could have the best technologies and the best champion countries here, but if we're not very competitive, frankly, with our competitor, which is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is very much not focused on clean energy build, then we'll be missing this massive opportunity for clean energy build globally. I just want to pick up on the theme of transitioning coal communities, because I think I'm from the original transitioning coal community, Scranton, Pennsylvania. We ran out of anthracite coal in the 1920s. The city depopulated, was economically stagnant for a century, is now kind of the poster child for the beginning or end of the Rust Belt, depending on which way you go. So I'm very much aware of this issue. It's where I grew up. The opportunities that this legislation, much of which was crafted by folks like Senator Barrasso and Senator Manchin, who very much have these communities in mind, the opportunities that they present to transitioning fossil communities are immense. I will give one example. One really interesting opportunity is the coal to nuclear transition. So if you think about what coal communities have, they have ties into the existing transmission network. They have communities that are accustomed to heavy industry and very comfortable with heavy industry. They have amazing workforces of skilled craft labor. A coal plant and a nuclear plant are very similar. You have a different way of boiling water up front, but then a very, very similar way of converting that steam to electricity, the same kind of interconnects with the grid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so much of the workforce in those communities can be repurposed to work in these things. Another problem, I know we'll talk more about this, is siting and permitting and community acceptance of projects. There's a terrific example. One of the advanced nuclear reactor companies whose project is being funded in part by this legislation, both the Energy Act and the IIJA, is TerraPower. And when TerraPower announced that it was going to site its first plant in Wyoming, they announced that it would be at one of 4 communities around the state. And people hate nuclear power plants, right? So the people must have been up in arms about siting it in those states. Like, literally could not have been further from the truth. The 4 mayors in those 4 communities started to fight over that nuclear power plant like it was a corporate headquarters relo, because that plant was going to bring $2 billion of investment into a community somewhere between 3,000 and 25,000 people. It was then going to operate for a century and employ several hundred people with jobs of over $100,000 a year, high-skilled labor, permanent tax base, amazing benefits to the school and community, all while continuing to produce extremely affordable, very reliable power using the existing grid. And there are many other technologies that can have the same story, things like enhanced geothermal systems and carbon capture systems. To some extent, even intermittent renewables around those communities, although those take more land and they don't necessarily have that. But these opportunities that are then very well supported by this program are a real game changer for the transition, and might end up being much more of the solution than it even appears today.
Thanks, Rich. Well, pivoting to siting and permitting as a topic, this is something that you basically can't have a conversation about climate policy nowadays without coming up, because it is very much, front of mind right now. Just to, throw out a few statistics, I think clean energy investment was up something like 20% last year. I think it's very likely that we're going to see a lot more than that this year as a reaction to policy. But there is also real concern that, investment won't take off to the hundreds of billions or trillions, level we need it to if we can't resolve some regulatory uncertainties that, may be hindering investment. As one example, the Princeton Net Zero Lab put out an analysis a couple months ago where they said their estimate is something on the order of 80% of the projected emissions reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act might not be realized if we can't increase the rate of transmission build out beyond 1% a year, which is what it is today, which is really concerning. I think that, all of us that work on climate, share, a belief that we need to be able to, build quickly, equitably, sustainably, and efficiently. So I wanted to turn to both Manish and Rich, because I think you two, occupy different spaces on this topic. And I wanted to see if you both had thoughts on where there are kind of key areas of tension that, are kind of fundamental areas of disagreement, and then if there are any areas, more importantly, that we can agree. So, Manish, do you want to kick it off?
The punchline is I think there's probably more that we can agree with than may appear. But let me just I actually think this is the question, right? This is the question that we need to be asking ourselves today, and you framed it incredibly well. How do we deploy clean energy equitably, sustainably, efficiently? And you had another adjective that was really good. But that is the question. And I think one of the broader challenges is the environmental movement has been incredibly good, and rightfully so, at playing defense. How do you stop bad projects? How do you save special places? NRDC taglines the Earth's best defense. We got the best lawyers helping us do that. We have to continue doing that. But at the same time, we need to go on the offense. If we're serious about actually protecting those places, about safeguarding frontline communities, we need to change the very economic systems that are creating the problems in the first place. We need to align those economic systems, the energy system, with our environmental and equity values. We need to transform those systems. So how do we actually imagine, envisage what that future looks like and actually create it? And that's where what is incredibly important right now is getting alignment on what the problem statement is. If you read the New York Times, and I'm going to take a little bit of right, they'll say NEPA's the problem, right? The National Environmental Protection Act. The problem is multifaceted. There are a lot of different issues that we need to solve to actually tackle this problem at the speed and scale that's required. Part of what we need to do is get clear on what the barriers are and how to overcome them. There are real barriers around siting. Where will the land come from? How do we protect local communities? How do we ensure protection to nature? There's a lot of good solutions around how that can be tackled. How you do upstream planning, how you involve communities from the start, how you actually talk about where there are go and no-go zones early on to give developers, to give industry clarity about where to go. We got to look at transmission. We need interstate transmission. We need to deal with the problem in the interconnection queue. There's major reforms that need to be done in transmission. We need to be thinking about how we actually get more coherence between local, state, and federal permitting laws. The point is there's many different pieces to this jigsaw puzzle. We need to see progress on all of them. Some of them involve local level work. Some of them involve state level work. Yes, some of them involve Washington. A few will involve the role of Congress, but it's all of the above. And I think part of what we need to do is quickly align on what those barriers are. And I think in many of those areas, we could actually find quick alignment about what needs to be done.
Robin, if you're looking for violent disagreement, I'm not sure. I agree with a lot of what Manish just said. First and foremost, I'll just say I completely agree that this is a multi-level, multifaceted problem. So the particular issues of federal environmental permitting do get a lot of press. Unfortunately, while I think that those are all very real issues, I think that they're like 20% or less of the problem. The regional issues and the state and local issues are also quite acute. I'm going to start at the state and local ones because they're actually, frankly, the ones that I'm most concerned about. So if you think about what happened in the 80s and 90s, we had a plague, a virus of moratoria against what is, at least today, the most important source of clean energy in the United States. So a wave of states in the 80s and 90s passed moratoria on new build of nuclear power plants. And that was not the only thing that stopped the build of nuclear power plants in the 80s and 90s, but it was a significant problem with those. And so folks in the room might not like nuclear, right? And they might be fine with those moratoria. But remember that if one clean energy technology can get a moratoria passed against on it, so can everything else. And so this is now happening across the Midwest and across the South to new build wind. So if you look at the great state of Iowa, a huge number of counties in Iowa have passed either full moratoria on new wind or such strong setback requirements, just meaning it's got to be so far away from a house or a road or a building that it's effectively impossible to build new wind. So Iowa already has some of the densest wind build on the planet. So they've gotten to about 55% of their power production from wind. That's a lot further than Germany, vaunted Germany and the Energiewende in Germany got with wind before Germans said, enough, we're not going to have more of this onshore wind. Iowa got a lot further, but our climate models, the ones that say that we can get to a net zero economy by 2050, all of those quietly say, and feel free to look them up, that Iowa is going to build somewhere between 4x and 17x more wind than it has today. And yet all of these moratoria and setback will make even doubling the wind in Iowa effectively impossible. The same thing is now happening to sequestration of CO2. So the great state of Louisiana, this is one of those cases where we're all going to have to start being for the things that we're not specifically for. And eventually we're all going to have to start being for the things we might have been specifically against, right? Because if we allow these state and local ordinances and sightings and zoning regulations to be weaponized against that unfavored clean energy technology, we better believe it's going to be used against our unfavored clean energy technology. We're all going to have to become a little bit more capitalist in this regard. But very quickly, the length of time that it has taken once you apply to get your project actually connected to the queue, you've got the best of intentions, you've got all the financing, you've got all these federal incentives and all that. You're ready to go. You've got your solar panels or you've got your wind turbines or whatever. You're ready to go. Great. We'll get back to you in 5 years about when you can connect that project into the grid. That is currently the solution that PJM, the largest interconnect in the country, has decided the solution to their very long interconnect queues is actually worse than the problem, which is that they've frozen all new interconnect applications for the next 5 years, right? So, I mean, folks are talking about 80% carbon reductions by 2030. We can't even get new power onto the grid in PJM for 5 more years, right? So there are solutions to this problem, but it's another big weedy area. And then lastly, yes, we do think that there are problems in the well, I wouldn't say problems. There are opportunities in the application, administration, and adjudication of several federal environmental permitting regimes. We think that there's a grand bargain there. And so the Aspen Institute has hosted a dialogue on this called Cleaner Faster. If you want to learn more about this, you can Google Aspen Cleaner Faster. But it effectively tees up a grand bargain, which says that clean energy technologies ought to get broad exceptions from a number of these environmental permitting statutes in return for all of the other technologies getting greatly accelerated administration and adjudication of their permitting regimes through it. So that would leave all the other problems, right? So it would leave the interconnect queue problems and the local siting and the zoning and all that, but at least it would significantly alleviate the federal environmental permitting load or at least decrease it on a number of these things to help them build faster. And we do think that there's a lot of opportunity there. There's significant debate going on right now in DC over modernization of all this, but it's going to take a lot of creativity and it's going to take everyone willing to make compromises if we're going to get there.
Manish, any reactions to that? No violent disagreement?
I think where there is going to be some disagreement, just to surface that, is we would not want to see any weakening of protections for vulnerable communities as part of the permitting reform process. Let me be absolutely unequivocal about that. And I think some of the efforts to try to reach a compromise require the reason, we think that is just a wrong thing to do. And second, we don't actually think that's where much of the problem is. This isn't what Rich is saying, but I'm just saying more broadly where some of the debate tends to focus on. But the broader point is there is a view that this must be fixed in Washington. And I think where we're all in agreement about, although Washington or Congress does have an important role to play, for example, on interstate transmission, there is a lot that can be done with existing authority. There's a lot that must be done at the local and state level. And we need to be honest about the political economy that a lot of the opposition to clean energy siting is being funded by the fossil fuel industry, and we need to shine a spotlight on that.
Well, I don't know if either of you like to go to Vegas, but I did want to ask quickly before we move on to the next topic if, Rich, you mentioned John Curtis, Representative Curtis, is on his way back to D.C. given the Republicans' package that they're putting together, which will tackle issues like siting and permitting. But if either of you wanted to put odds on getting a deal this Congress, Yeah.
I'll be very realistic. So for folks that don't work in DC, it moves. The glaciers are melting faster than DC moves. So it is a slow process, and that is by design, right? So this is clearly thorny issues that are going to require a lot of time and deliberation, right? Unfortunately, time that we don't have from clean energy bill, but DC moves slowly. My hypothesis would be that we've got a less than a 50% chance of getting something done on this Congress, but it is also inevitable, right? I mean, if we're all serious about a clean energy transition, we're going to have to fix these things at all levels. And so I typically bet on things that are inevitable, but I'm not sure that it'll happen this Congress. I think we'll have a great conversation. We'll have some great marker legislation to get things going. I hope that we can get a deal done this Congress, but my guess is we start the conversation now. Maybe we finish it in the next Congress.
Actually, violent agreement with that. I don't see actually the right type of deal, in my mind, emerging in this political Congress context in this Congress. But I do think that we need to start those conversations now, so that in 2025, because we will need something, and my hope is in 2025 we'll create the conditions to put forward the type of reforms we need to see.
Robin, can I actually jump in here just for a minute? So I'm not going to make a bet on the permitting reform. I'll let you guys do the Vegas odds on that. But I just think that I'm sitting here thinking about this conversation, and we're talking about like what these communities need to do, and we're talking about what has to happen in Washington, and we're literally at this phase now where we need to start talking about implementation of this legislation, which means that this legislation has to work for the people in these places. So they have to be at the table developing solutions. They have to be at the table when permitting solutions or permitting fights are coming up. And honestly, part of the reason that we are in the pickle that we're in now is because for so long, people in communities, the people who actually have experience creating jobs and training workers, the people that are economically affected in these places, they're not the ones that are informing federal policy solutions on climate, right? So getting back to what we started in the beginning, I mean, fundamentally, we look at this as an economic problem, and we can talk about siting and we can talk about all these things that Manish and Rich have talked about, but when the truth of the matter comes to it and you start talking about clean energy projects, I want to know, and I think the people in the communities that we work with want to know, that those clean energy projects are actually going to work economically for them, because a lot of times they do not, right? So anyway, just to put some other ideas out there that we should be considering as we think about these things.
Thanks for jumping in there.
Yeah.
Well, Heidi, I think that's actually a very perfect segue to
set you up.
what I think the last question will be, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, which is, you spend a lot of time working with coal and fossil communities. Mm-hmm. I think those very much should be categorized as vulnerable communities, in the sense that these are places that have sacrificed a lot in order to get the country to the economic place that it is today. And it won't be a just transition if we leave those places behind.
That's
so
right. Yeah.
In terms of the work that you're doing there, what are you seeing in terms of the messengers that those communities trust? Like, who do they look to for information that they feel they can, believe in? And in terms of workforce needs, I'm wondering if you could also comment, so it's a two-part question, on how we think about transitioning those communities to jobs of the quote-unquote future, because I think there's one version of the world in which you take someone who is a drilling rig operator and now they're maintaining a solar array, and then there's another version of the world which is we need to find people jobs that are similar to the jobs that they currently do. So wanted to get your reactions to those two questions.
I'd love to. So first, I just want to echo something that Rich said earlier. The solutions for these places when you're solving an economic problem is a variety. You're investing in a variety of sectors, right? There's not one single silver bullet that's going to get these communities where they need to go economically. So clean energy is absolutely on the table, but so is manufacturing, so is the knowledge economy jobs, tourism, local foods, regenerative agriculture. The take that we work on, which is actually very much in line with what the way that the Aspen Institute looks at this, is we start fundamentally with what are the assets of a place, and we build from there, right? So point number one is it's going to be a multitude of things, right? I think when you are talking with these communities, again, and just to give you a flavor of the diversity of communities that we work with. And first of all, not all coal communities are EJ communities, but there is a significant amount of our coal communities that are EJ communities, right? So we work with communities in Wyoming, we work with communities deep in West Virginia, and we work with a ton of tribes, from the Crow in Northern Cheyenne to Four Corners, a number of different tribes there. And so they are really, they're thinking about, these are places that have, as I said earlier, a deep distrust of the government. They have dealt with persistent poverty for a really, really long time, right? And they also, though, have, like, thinking about, like, some places in the deep in Appalachia or even in the middle of the country. These are places that have pride in what they have done, right? Pride in what they're 100%, a lot of times very, very with us on climate solutions, but they have pride that their grandfather was a coal miner, right? So the trusted messengers for them are the organizations that are really firmly, deeply rooted in those places, have a lot of trust within the community, and are solutions focused. When you start having external groups coming in and asking people to shut things down that take away their jobs, that really roils feathers. And Manish, they don't differentiate between a Sierra Club or an NRDC. You could say, oh, we're completely different. They don't see that, right? They almost see, like, I would say, the environmental communities as a monolith sometimes, right? So that's the reaction we get a lot. And then just to answer your question about the workforce, you have to think about the skill set of the people in these places when you're thinking about what jobs they have. And and by the way, too, I think there's a common myth out there where we think a lot about coal miners or power plant workers, but if you take a power plant and you shut down a power plant, for every one person that loses their job, 4 more people in that community lose their job. We work with communities across the country that have lost 70, 80, up to 90% in one place of their tax revenue when the plant closed, right? So this is not just a problem that affects miners or power plant workers. It's a really big problem, right? And so, we're looking at a lot of solutions like remediation, for example, that says, okay, if these have been power plant workers or mine operators who can work this equipment, they can also work this equipment, right? So you have to consider the skill set, and it's not always the case. I don't know if it is ever the case that you're going to find people to be technical wind engineers, right? That's just not possible. So you really have to be realistic in a lot of cases.
Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah.
It's really so important to think about the people element of the transition, because if we don't get that right, none of this will happen.